on the Zero Hour. I, as always, am perennially your host, Richard RJ Eskow. We just lived through vicariously the Biden Putin summit, breathlessly awaited by Western media and the days leading up to it. And to talk about how the media behaved during and after, I'm going to defer that conversation to my next guest and me, Max Blumenthal. You know him well. Max is co-founder and editor, or is it founder and co-editor of The Gray Zone, which can be found at thegrayzone.com. He's the author of a number of books. I believe the latest is The Management of Savagery, which you should definitely read. And he, like many of us, has been following the press coverage of the Putin of the of the Biden Putin summits. Without any further ado, Max Blumenthal, welcome back to the Zero Hour.
Always good to be here. Nice to see you.
Yeah, same here. All right, I have thoughts. I know you have thoughts. Let's have your thoughts go first. What struck you most about the coverage of this summit?
Well, I did some media last night about the summit, just kind of reacting right after it concluded. And one interviewer asked me, how would I rate it on a scale from 1 to 10? What was accomplished? Was it a successful summit? And I actually didn't even expect to get this question, and I didn't know how to answer it. I mean, not also because I hate quantifying things between 1 and 10, but I was just like, what was accomplished there? It actually prompted me to ask myself, what was actually accomplished? I don't know what was accomplished. There were some discussions about cybersecurity and a strategic dialogue, but the simplest, most basic things that should have been accomplished, like returning diplomats and consulates to allow people-to-people exchanges between Russia and the U.S., that's like a low-hanging fruit, and it wasn't accomplished as far as I know.
I thought they did agree to put diplomats back where they were. No?
Not in every case.
Okay.
And there are they couldn't reach like a basic comprehensive agreement on that. Another example would be the registering of state-backed media outlets as foreign agents, which started with the U.S. doing this whole FBI investigation into RT America and then demanding they register as a foreign agent, which triggered the reciprocal action of Russia registering Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and Voice of America, which are backed by the U.S. The former was set up by the CIA as foreign agents. Like that didn't end. And that was the whole tit for tat atmosphere that was generated through Russiagate, when a coalition of hardcore neocon Cold Warriors and Hillary Clinton dead enders and DNC elites kind of collaborated to launch a new Cold War and generate this atmosphere of hostility. But whatever happened, I mean, I would like, defer to you if you think there were any serious accomplishments and I'm missing anything. I can't think of anything that, this wasn't like SALT 1 and 2 with Reagan and Gorbachev, where they came away with serious negotiations that actually yielded returns that bettered civilization. That's what U.S. Russia summits should be about. Instead, what we got was this kind of, I mean, to borrow a term that, was used to basically, kind of as a pejorative about the Soviet Union. It was sort of like a U.S. corporate media Potemkin village that was designed to create the perception of a Biden win and that he faced down Putin. It was this kind of East Coast establishment fantasy that Biden was going to go down and face the bad guy Putin, who's the evil authoritarian who's killing all the opposition and spreading this anti-democratic atmosphere and breaking the transatlantic alliance. It all started with the Time magazine cover I don't know if you can put it up in post, Troy, but the cover was absolutely insane. It shows Joe Biden looking like a cross between a racist Southern cop and like Boss Hogg and like a Tom Clancy, CIA hero, and Joe Biden, and he's sitting there with his mirrored aviator glasses, and Vladimir Putin is reflecting in his glasses, and he's facing him down, and it's all about how Biden's going to take on Putin, which is that's the atmosphere the media was trying to cultivate. Joe Biden went into the summit obviously wanting to establish some space to negotiate and some relief from the constant antagonism, because the U.S. does need to work with Russia on the Arctic. It does need to work with Russia in Syria and in Libya. It does need to work with Russia in Afghanistan, where the U.S. is trying to pull out its conventional troops and seek some kind of counterinsurgency continuation. It does need to work with Russia on cybersecurity treaties on a whole host. And then, of course, the New START treaties. There should, intermediate ballistic missiles. All these areas that Trump tried to work with Russia on was blocked. Biden wanted to do it, and the media created this whole atmosphere that Biden's team allowed, first by preventing any Russian journalists from interacting with Biden, except for the guy from Radio Free Europe, the CIA network. He's the only Russian who got to ask a question. The rest were 4 corporate media hacks from the Beltway Press Corps who were pre-selected. And Biden comes out to his press conference after meeting with Putin for 3 hours and complains that once again, the reporters are all pre-selected for him, which just shows how carefully managed he is. And every single question, the first question was, I think, from Jonathan Karl, who's like one of these, they're all White House press correspondents, which means like their experience on Russia is limited to having breakfast at the International House of Pancakes, or like going to Russia House in DuPont Circle here. Like they know nothing about Russia. So Jonathan Karl's first question, it begins as follows: according to U.S. intelligence, and you know where that's going to go, and it's all about all the evil things Putin's done. Then he follows up, what if Alexei Navalny dies? Alexei Navalny, Russian opposition figure. I could hardly call him an opposition leader, but he's obviously who the U.S. favors. He's become the U.S. Juan Guaido. He's in jail for like 2 years. Whatever you think about his imprisonment, it was pretty clear that the press was trying to indulge this fantasy of him dying to get Biden to commit to some kind of hostile response. Then comes a question about ransomware attacks. I mean, we heard about the ransomware hack of this pipeline,
right,
that supplies gas up and down the Northeast. We don't know who's responsible for that. The press immediately pointed the finger at Russia. The attack may have emanated from Russia, but there are millions of people in Russia, and not all of them are Vladimir Putin and the FSB. And then they got $5 million out of it. That wasn't really like Russian FSB tradecraft to extract money. They even said, we have no political objectives, we just wanted money. But this reporter demanded that Biden commit to a military response for the next ransomware attack. So the reporter is pushing for World War III, 4, and 5, a nuclear holocaust, because of a mysterious ransomware attack. Biden wouldn't commit to that. Then you have Caitlin Collins from CNN. I think she used to be at the Daily Caller or something. And she manages to pull Biden back in because, Biden, he's a ornery. Like, he would fight with people on the campaign trail who would come up to him and challenge him. He would always have to be held back by his aides from biting the faces off of people who would challenge him. He recently threatened to run a reporter over because they asked about Israel, Palestine. He asked them to stand in front of this hybrid vehicle he was driving in Detroit so he could run them over. And he charges, he's about to walk away, and he charges away from the exit and charges at the reporter. And I actually can sympathize with him for this. He was like, if you don't understand what I'm doing here, then you shouldn't be in the business. But this reporter was saying, what have you done to change Putin's behavior? What have you done to get him to Name Alexei Navalny. What have you done to get him to stop these attacks on our democracy? What will you do to threaten him? And it's just this constant pushing. It's a pretend adversarial journalism that is designed to corner the president, no matter whether they're Donald Trump or Joe Biden, into a more militaristic and hostile position. And Biden actually came at the reporter, like Angry Joe. But for the first time, I really sympathized with him. And I listened carefully to the press conference. At one point, Biden actually said, I'm sorry to disappoint you if I'm not going to be going to war with Russia. This was the same thing that Trump was saying to the Beltway press corps, too. It's just he was Donald Trump. And so they created this faux drama about Trump hating the press and the First Amendment, when really he was reacting viscerally to the press attempting to prevent diplomacy and peacemaking between two nuclear powers. This hostile atmosphere continued into the press conference that Vladimir Putin held, which was an amazing study in contrast. If you look at Biden, he's got pages of notes in front of him. He spoke only for a half hour. Putin had no notes. He's speaking through a translator, but providing very carefully detailed policy and discussing the Minsk Accords, and he speaks for an hour. But the main difference is that Putin and his side did not insulate him from the American reporters. In this case, this Beltway pack of jingoistic hyenas who had set up this confrontation to make Putin look defensive and fearful. That's the kind of State Department, CIA objective, is to make Putin seem like he's afraid and he's a leader under siege because Navalny has been jailed. And I can talk about Navalny and the reality there, which is quite different from what's presented in the US. And I think we should also talk about the American exceptionalist fantasy that was projected from Biden and the press. But Putin was subjected to finger wagging from CNN, from ABC, and they all had the same talking points. It was like they were all on the same page. It really felt like these reporters had been coached by someone either in US intelligence, someone in the State Department, or someone who had been in one of those positions and was a Russia hardliner, because they all hit the same points. Navalny, cyber attacks, and authoritarianism. And the ABC reporter gets up and says, "You have poisoned and killed all your opponents. When will you, what are you so afraid of?" And it's about making Putin look defensive. The reality is, if Biden was confident, he would have spent an hour addressing the Russian press and addressing these criticisms in a point by point way, the way Putin did. And it almost was flipped, that the lack of confidence the US displayed here was flipped on its head by the Beltway press corps. And then you see the day after reports, CNN opinion from Frida Gittes, who is a just imperial stooge, big loss for Putin. Jennifer Rubin, veteran neocon who's been welcomed into the Democratic Party like the rest of the neocons, Bill Kristol and David Frum. She pronounces that Putin was put on the defensive by a confident democracy led by the young ABC reporter who shouted down Putin. And no one really actually quotes Putin's responses.
And can I just interrupt you for a second?
Yeah.
That's a perfect example of what people in this country have always imagined Pravda-style press propaganda to be. The American president was humiliated by the ferocity of the direct questioning of the valiant Russian reporters. I mean, if you take Jennifer Rubin's exact words and flip them, substitute American for Russian and Putin for Biden, you think, these propagandists working for the state media organ, of course they're going to write this way. But that's the interesting thing. There's so many dimensions of this to me. I guess I would say my reaction in some way was like yours, but starting from the opposite end, which is that all this is going on with minimal attention, certainly none in the US media that I could see, to the fact that we're hovering on the edge of apocalypse every minute. Nuclear holocaust, could happen at any time between these two nuclear powers. and instead they're talking about, trivial issues. And I think the other thing that struck me about it, Max, is that it all seems to happen on the meta level now. That it's not about what these two countries and their leaders can do to in the world of diplomacy to make it a safer world or whatever. It's all about the appearance of what
Yeah.
happens and how the appearance of what happens affects the other appearances of what happens. It's all a shadow show, it seems to me. And the last thing I'll say is, for the moment, is I continue to be amazed at what seems to me to be the escalating weaponization of the U.S. media. You alluded to it, but even against its own government, if need be, is this kind of bloodthirsty, phantom haunting the halls of power, and you're not being vicious enough, you're not being lethal enough, you're not being aggressive enough, and that combined with what seems to me to be among liberal Democrats a kind of Faustian bargain that says we'll accept a few incremental improvements on the home front, and in return, we'll let the world burn. And the media, and we'll let the media be our attack dogs for that. It's really an astonishing moment to me in American media history and American history in general.
Yeah, you couldn't have said it better. And I was going to say the way that the word Soviet is used in the US lexicon, the mainstream US lexicon, perfectly captures what took place and what was crafted by the Beltway press corps in their behavior. You had Jennifer Jacobs, the White House press correspondent from Bloomberg, actually boast on Twitter that she heckled Putin, asking him, "What are you afraid of?" that was their. It was just a heckling section to call Putin a coward, and claiming that Biden flashed a big toothy grin at her, which was obviously a complete fantasy. And I doubt Putin heard what she said. And this atmosphere was encouraged by Joe Biden, who boasted that he had called Putin a killer when he met with him, which was obviously a completely made up story because Biden was in Moscow as vice president at the time in, I think, 2011 or 2012 to get the reset with Russia back on track. And he was in a room full of people who would have heard him say such a provocative and warlike comment. And Putin himself said he didn't remember Biden saying that. Then Biden spent the whole time walking back the fact that he called Putin a killer because he had to negotiate. But the point is that the press was it was pretending to be adversarial by challenging the leader of a foreign country who couldn't give a crap what they think, and then fantasizing about Biden smiling at their performance and patting them on the head and then pronouncing a victory for the strong American confident leader. Just absolute propagandists. I mean, this was the perfect it perfectly captured the Beltway press corps. And they didn't have the excuse of being against Trump and how mean he was to them. Biden was rolling over backwards to win them over this time. And even he couldn't control himself in acting out against them because they're so absolutely obnoxious. Why didn't one reporter, I mean, what would have happened to their career? But why didn't one reporter think to ask Biden, "You are constantly talking about Alexei Navalny, sir. You are weaponizing Navalny against Russia. Why have you not said one word about Julian Assange, who faces 50 times more jail time for producing journalism and revealing documents that we used at my publication?" Why didn't anyone think to ask about Assange? Because they never in the Beltway press corps will approach a US president from an actual adversarial position. It just simply never happens.
Well, and as long as we're talking about the media coverage, the other thing that struck me, we've had days now of Putin won't call Navalny by name. they're making a huge issue about the fact that Putin won't use Navalny's name. And they've challenged him on it. I'm hearing this over and over like a mantra. So I went back and I looked at what Obama had to say when Edward Snowden released, all that vitally important information that the American people deserved to know and deserve to know about what their government is doing to them. And among other things, Obama said, called him a 29-year-old hacker. I don't care that much about a 29-year-old hacker. He was already 30, by the way, but 29-year-old. So, they don't challenge an American president for being dismissive to somebody who's at odds with his own government, but somehow Putin's stand, which is, predictable.
Biden called Assange a high-tech terrorist.
Who
He never
did?
said his Biden himself.
Well, yeah. So that there you have it, right? Because we condemn, we broadly speaking, the closed societies of other countries, but we reserve our real vitriol for the people who release information in our own society. And of course, that goes on. Has a reporter ever asked Biden, or for that matter, during his time, Obama, about Assange, to your knowledge?
Well, I actually caught up with Assange's brother and his father, Gabriel and John Shipton, respectively, in DC. We connected at the Jefferson Memorial, and I interviewed them, and they were with a camera crew that I think they're doing a little documentary of their own, but they were here to get the word out about this journalist who was targeted by the CIA and is now in a maximum security prison being tormented on lockdown in the UK at the behest of US intelligence, because there are poodles in the UK. And they have only gotten one mainstream media request since being here, from Tucker Carlson. No one else is seeking to interview them. No one else in the mainstream press that relied on WikiLeaks year after year for front page story has mentioned anything to Biden about Assange. And of course, Biden, he's kind of Joe Biden, like he's hiding from the press much more than Trump did, but I don't think he would be asked about it. He hasn't in the press conferences he's done. In fact, what Gabriel said on Tucker Carlson is that no member of Congress has spoken out for Julian Assange in the Biden era. So that really says it all. And it speaks to the mentality and sensibility of the Beltway press corps and of the mainstream press, which is really based along the Acela corridor between Washington and New York. And I'm sure like Tom Frank, who you've had on, would be able to speak to this in a much more colorful way, but they really just represent the mentality of the East Coast establishment, which was so shell-shocked when Donald Trump was elected and blames Julian Assange, according to Hillary Clinton's narrative, for her defeat and spending 4 years with Trump. And they won't let this go, nor will they let go the idea that Vladimir Putin is the Death Star and that he represents this the essence of authoritarianism. Whereas in the Trump era, Mohammed bin Salman got the red carpet from Oprah and The Rock when he came here. And the East Coast establishment and the West Coast establishment, Hollywood, was cutting all kinds of deals with the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund. So this is about the sensibility of a certain class on the East Coast, especially, and how and how much skin in the game they have with imperialism. Like they really feel invested in America as an empire. They feel a deep kinship with their fellow, Stanford and Yale classmates who are now in the CIA and State Department. They feel close to Jake Sullivan, the NSC director, who comes from that same context. They identify with Samantha Power, who runs USAID and was at Harvard. I mean, this is all one class of people. And so that's what you saw on display in Geneva at this summit, is And then you have the climbers, you have the opportunists who come into these corporate media positions, and they want to win. They know how to win over these people. So a big performance of hostility in front of Putin, well, that's going to make your career.
Well, you're speaking to, and again, my guest is Max Blumenthal. Max, you're speaking to exactly what I've been wondering about, which is the mechanism behind this kind of thing. I have assumed it's partially cultural. It's partially what Gore Vidal and others have called the conspiracy of shared values, and what people talk about over, drinks or at cocktail parties or dinners or whatever. I've wondered if there isn't anything more overt about financial relationships, interlocking boards between media companies and military contractors. I've wondered if that isn't a factor in all of this. I mean, I don't watch MSNBC anymore, but I'm told that John Bolton was on to give post summit commentary, one of the worst war criminals and bloodthirsty maniacs.
I mean, he's constantly on there and CNN, and I mean, Bill Kristol has been totally rehabilitated. This is a guy who not only helped gin up the Iraq War with the Project for a New American Century, setting out the neocon vision of the quote unquote benevolent empire, but he also discovered Sarah Palin. He's responsible for making Sarah Palin McCain's VP candidate. He's been totally forgiven and welcomed in.
And so is Steve Schmidt, the consultant who made sure it happened, who's also been embraced and is now beloved in this world. So,
yeah, remember Woke Bill Kristol? Ari Melber had this segment, Woke Bill Kristol, and he's bobbing his head with Fat Joe, this washed up rapper in a limo. There was some lobbyist next to them. I think he was the chief lobbyist for Comcast. And Ari Melber's like, yeah, I rolled with Woke Bill Kristol. It was tight. Like, what the hell? I used to work with that guy at The Nation. It's just like, but it's all
I remember
about
Dave Gregory dancing with Karl Rove too.
Yeah, but that was widely mocked, and they were like MC Rove, and Rove was beatboxing at the White House Press Correspondents' Dinner. That was like a source of derision, and even Stephen Colbert mocked it. But today, Stephen Colbert, who comes out of the same context as the rest of these people, the same socioeconomic context, is the embodiment of the parody that he used to play. He's like a parody of his former self, which was itself a parody of mainstream and conservative media. He has fully invested in he every night during the Trump era, his monologue was about Russiagate. It was cultivating and manufacturing consent for a new Cold War.
Absolutely.
He dressed down Tulsi Gabbard when she was in her stage of like actually taking on imperial power in the national security state. He dressed her down. He treated her like absolute trash. And then, Obama comes on and it's like, oh, this is basically like Buddha, the golden child, and Jesus. So Trump prompted this circling of the wagons for the East Coast establishment, and they won't forget those lessons. For them, they never want to go back. It's the mantra of never again. Never again will they go back to a right-wing populist president with a strong grassroots base that ends up in an episode like January 6th, nor will they allow that to take place from the left. And luckily, Bernie wasn't exactly going to fight like Trump. And he's like, well, I'll just take my position on the Senate Budget Committee. And, half of my staff are just like Democrat professional managerial class like Fez Shakir and Matt Duss anyway. So, happy to just play ball, but they would never let someone actually come from the left. What they want is a return to the fake consensus of 2008 when it was Obama versus McCain, and you had a Republican essentially agree to step aside and take the honorable position of allowing America to have its first Black neoliberal president who would not prosecute any Wall Street banksters. That's what they want. They want Mitt Romney to be the Republican candidate, and they want to be in control. They want control over everything. And Biden even though he's like the most traditional politician you could ask for, coming out of the Senate, which is like our House of Lords. He was for the Iraq War. I can hardly think of any wars he wasn't for. Uh, Even he is too independent for this element that is represented in the Beltway press corps, this establishment. He, at some points he took on the generals over the Afghan surge.
Right.
He knows, although his mind isn't fully there, he knows foreign policy more than any president in my lifetime. He has more foreign policy experience, and so they need to keep him in check. And when I say they, I mean I'm not just referring to the media. There is this interwoven network that Ray McGovern, the former CIA insider who actually briefed JFK and LBJ, he calls it the Mickey Mat. I can't. It's military intelligence. I can't get all the letters right, but media is part of this interwoven network that comprises what we would call the deep state. There is a deep state, but it's not the what Trump called the deep state.
Right. Edward Glennon wrote his book, Double State and Double Government, or something like that.
Yeah.
He calls it double government, but he's talking about the same phenomenon. And we saw it for me, I saw it most starkly when Trump, obviously not my favorite president, to put it mildly, but when Trump proposed a troop reduction, a troop drawdown in Afghanistan, and we roundly got scolded by the press. And then Democrats and Republicans in Congress came together to make it impossible to reduce troop levels that year by requiring the sign off of the CIA and the generals and everybody who's supposed to be under the command of the president, gave them all the right to overrule the president about a decision whether to reduce troops. That to me was like the most overt. No, the one thing you cannot do is reduce our military footprint. And I guess in terms of Biden and the summit, if in this meta shadow world of power and militarism we live in now, I guess the most generous interpretation I can make for his goals for this summit was that he wanted to get not so much goals in the literal sense, but in the meta sense, that if he could get through it and not be forced to, in the words of Senator Bob Menendez, not just punch Putin in the nose, but break his nose. If he could get, I mean, it's so brutal and ugly. If he could just get through this thing somehow, that maybe that would have injected a slightly pacifying current in this warlike atmosphere. And I firmly believe that that was his intent, if I didn't know who was running the foreign policy apparatus of his government. But I'm like, my head is spinning.
Yeah. And within this East Coast establishment that has so much skin in the imperial game, there's a prevalent sense of American innocence, because they've been involved on various levels in so many crimes. I mean, just look at how the New York Times laundered the WMD deceptions on behalf of the neocons who were in the Bush Pentagon. And many of those figures, I mean, Judith Miller was drummed out and sort of subjected to public humiliation after so many American troops came back without their legs, arms, or lives. But you still have Michael Gordon or David Sanger or any of these figures that are still there. So they feel invested in what the U.S. is doing abroad, and so they have to adopt this mentality of innocence. It's they're compartmentalizing, and so that flows into this summit, and it plays out in very absurd ways that average people, including people who may not even have Ivy League educations, just find absolutely absurd. For example, when Biden says that Putin needs to stop intervening and interfering in elections because it could be seen, because he needs to consider how he's seen, as if the U.S. would never do that and had never done that. when in fact the US literally ran the Russian government during the 1990s. I mean, short of a military invasion, that is the most interference that you can enjoy or or enact over a government. I mean, they were setting Boris Yeltsin's economic policies. American consultants were sent with CIA management to steal the election for Yeltsin in 1996. Yanks to the rescue was the Time magazine cover. And then the National Endowment for Democracy, the regime change arm of the US government, proceeds to initiate color revolutions on Russia's periphery while funding a network of opposition figures dedicated to regime change inside Russia to inflame the situation inside Russia and antagonize Putin. Navalny is absolutely a product of this network. So the idea that the US isn't intervening or interfering in elections or cultivating opposition figures, and that Putin is the only one doing it, this was never challenged by anyone in this entire summit, including on US cable media, except by Vladimir Putin, who said, we don't want on January 6th in our country. And then he's accused of false equivalencies for saying that. It's not a false equivalency. It's actually an understatement, because what countries around the world have been subjected to through US intelligence and the National Endowment for Democracy is so much worse than January 6th.
Oh, no question. I've made that point before, that that feeling that a lot of Democrats in particular felt on January 6th. Well, okay, now try to imagine that feeling multiplied by the fact that they arrested your son, your husband or wife, your mother. They shot at least one of the three. Your government was put under military control for 20 years. When you finally toppled the military, another country came in and put it back in again. Spread that out over 60 years. And then tell me, when I almost use bad language, but when that QAnon shaman has been your president for 10 years, throwing all your friends in jail, then you tell me how it feels, and maybe you would have a different view of U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah, imagine if the QAnon shaman had been trained for years by Russian and Chinese intelligence through various workshops, that the QAnon shaman had then been designated as president of the United States by Russia and China. Imagine Russia and China are far more powerful than the United States, by the way, and have the power to sanction it, because the United States will not allow the QAnon shaman to take over the White House. And they begin to prevent fuel deliveries to the United States. They begin to supply the QAnon shaman with support for staging military coups. The US-Mexico border is filled with proxy forces backed by Russia and China. Imagine an entire project of destabilization with massive protests that turn violent, holding US cities under siege, with US cities in flames. That's what Venezuela experienced as a direct result of tens and tens of millions of dollars flowing into the Venezuelan right-wing opposition to produce a figure like Juan Guaido, because his mentor and the real leader, Leopoldo Lopez, was under house arrest. And then the US is pointing the finger at Venezuela, saying, Lopez, he's an opposition figure who is a political prisoner, when he had been leading these vicious, violent street demonstrations that killed so many Venezuelans, where Venezuelans were targeted just for having darker skin because they were identified with the Chavista movement between 2014 and 2017. I mean, the Venezuelan Justice Ministry was bombed by helicopter by opposition hooligans. The Supreme Court was bombed. Leopoldo Lopez and Guaido's DC fake ambassador, they led marches on Venezuelan government buildings that were then firebombed. And that fake ambassador here in DC, Carlos Vecchio, whose entire salary is now paid by Samantha Power and USAID, he was invited to Biden's inauguration. The insurrectionists abroad are treated like heroes here by the Biden administration. And Alexei Navalny in Russia is seen actually by the majority of the population, but especially, the people who support Putin, which is the majority, and his former United Russia Party, is seen as a Russian Juan Guaido.
And he also, for those who may not know, there are videos of him calling Muslims cockroaches and said, "What do you do with a cockroach?" And then getting out a gun, if I recall the video correctly, a machine gun or something, which is, by the way, a wasteful and inefficient and destructive way to kill cockroaches, but certainly gives us a glimpse into the kind of human being he is. That we're the kind of human being we're elevating as a hero. So,
Yeah, I mean,
okay.
that itself doesn't justify him being jailed.
Of course not. I'm not
However,
suggesting that, but
it
yeah.
speaks to how delusional the Russia hardliners in the Democratic Party are, because they actually paint Navalny as a progressive Democratic hero when he was one of the main figures at the neo-Nazi fascist rallies that paraded through Moscow during the, around 2008, 2009, where people were actually sighailing and holding up the Russian imperial flag. Navalny himself is not a neo-Nazi. He was simply trying to court that element and to create this anti-Putin coalition with him at the top. But the real issue here, the issue for Russia, and it's an issue for countries around the world that is really rocking Nicaraguan politics right now, is that the U.S. has had this fairly open program of doing in public and overtly what the CIA used to do covertly, which is to simply pay and train opposition figures, NGOs, and media outlets to create the conditions for regime change, which often turn extremely violent and destroy countries' economies. And then if the leader of a country, like the elected president in Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega, Maduro, Putin, refuses to concede to the demands of these opposition movements, which are almost always very unpopular in the countries, they get slapped with sanctions. Their country's put under siege, and they're painted as global evildoers by the U.S. press, the same press corps, these jingoistic lackeys that we saw on display in Geneva. That's the program, and countries are beginning to say, enough. We don't want a January 6th. But the U.S. never had to deal with this issue of China and Russia actually paying the quote unquote insurrectionists at the Capitol, arming them. That's why it was like, once the police decided to mobilize, I don't know where they were. Like, I was there that day and I'd never seen, when I go there on any other day, even when there's no one there, I see more cops. But when the police finally decided to mobilize, they were out of there by like 6 p.m. and everybody just left.
And if we got started on some of the stories the inaccurate stories we've been told on January 6th or about January 6th, we'd never stop. But unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you for helping me get a little bit more grounded, although I still feel like scrambled in the head after the events of the last few days, even more so than usual.
I think you were pretty clear-eyed.
So. Oh, okay. Well, I appreciate that. You certainly were. So, Max Blumenthal of thegrayzone.com. As always, thanks for your insights. And as always, thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks a lot, Richard.
You bet. We'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.